Get started. Welcome everyone to another learning lunch with Connie Chang as part of APIDAHM 2024. I'm really excited. My name is Dr. Lena Ha. I use she, her pronouns. Before we get started, we always like to do the land and labor acknowledgement. So the Assistant Director, Teresa Wilson, will start.
All right, so for the land acknowledgement, Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tulo-Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize that their continued relationships with their land and waterways. We further acknowledge that the Morrill Land Grant College Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands in California and other areas in the West. Our labor recognition. Virginia Tech acknowledges that its Blacksburg campus sits partly on land that was previously the site of the Smithfield and Solitude plantations, owned by members of the Preston family. Between the 1770s and the 1860s, the Prestons and other local white families that owned parcels of what became Virginia Tech also owned hundreds of enslaved people. Enslaved Black people generated resources that financed Virginia Tech's predecessor institution, the Preston and Olin Institute, and they also worked on the constructions of its building.
Yeah, so thank you all for being here. My name is Kirsten Dean. I work in the university libraries. I use any pronouns, and we're so excited to have Connie joining us today. So I don't know, how many of you, does anyone here play tabletop role-playing games or are gamers of any kind? Does anyone have experience with gaming? Okay, so this will be a learning experience, I think, for a lot of folks in the room. So Connie is many things. Connie is a screenwriter, a game designer, a game runner, a game player, a content creator, and I'm sure I'm missing all the other amazing things. There's a huge list, but I'm just going to say creative and a thoughtful person that I'm really excited to hear from about their journey today. So let's welcome Connie Chang.
Hey folks, it's really lovely to be here. I do have a couple slides that I've prepared to kind of just go over my journey, who I am, what all of this is. But I think before we even get there, I'd love to just like go around and a quick round of introductions so I know who all of you are through this digital space and to meet space. I'll start. I'm Connie. My pronouns are they, he, and she. I'm streaming to you all from the unceded territories of the Massachusetts people here on the East Coast. And I'm really bad at rotating objects in my head, unlike a lot of STEM folk. So I don't know what direction is where. So I think whoever's closest to me should go next.
Yeah, I'm Alex. I'm a grad student in sociology, pronouns we him, and yeah. I'm Luke, a third year in biology. Pronouns are he, they. Yeah.
I'm Tian. I'm a current PhD student. I work with this diverse inclusion strategic partnership. I go by she, her.
Oh, my bad. I'm Sanjana. I'm a sophomore doing cybersecurity management and analytics, and I go by she, her.
Matt, male. Brian, I'm a doctoral student at College of Engineering, pronoun he, him.
I'm Jenny, a junior CMDA major. I go by she, her.
Hi, I'm Bindu. I'm a graduate student in the PhD in computer science program, and I go by he.
Hello, I'm Swanan. I'm also a doctoral student in computer science, and I also go by he.
Hello, I'm Min. I'm also doctoral student in computer science, and I work with Rinto and Swanand in the same research lab.
Oh, awesome. You want to get back there? Here.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Well, this is Jenny, another Jenny, I came from mathematics engineering. And it was about gaming, I'm really bad for that.
I'm Michelle, she, her, and I'm a PhD student.
Well, I'm Ilya, he, him pronouns, and accounting masters.
I'm Teresa Wilson. I use she, her pronouns. I am the assistant director for the APIDA Plus Center.
Would you like to introduce
Excellent.
yourself?
Yeah. Sorry, kind
My
of
name
inundated
is
you.
Krish.
Okay.
My pronouns are he, him. And I work in the aerospace engineering department.
Awesome. Thank you. Welcome.
Excellent. Is that everyone? I
Yes.
don't know if I have the full scope. Okay, lovely.
Yeah, you
Lovely. Well, it's really nice to meet all of you. Yeah, so let's just get started. I've got some slides. Let me see if I can remember how to use Zoom. Share screen. Bam. Okay, let me know if y'all are seeing this big graphic of my face.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. So, hello, Virginia Tech. As I mentioned before, I am Connie Chang, pronouns they, he, she. I am an actual play game master and a tabletop role-playing game designer. And I'm really excited to be participating in this learning lunch organized by the lovely folks at the APIDA Plus Center. And I'm also really excited for the Q&A discussion and extended talk later today as well. So in these next few slides, I'm just going to go over my journey as a TTRPG professional, as well as some of the highlights of this adventure so far, and my overall approach to storytelling and art making. If at any point any of you have any questions about what any of these terms mean or anything like that, feel free to raise your hand, though I probably won't be able to see it because Zoom squished you all down quite immensely, like the size of grains of rice for me. So if someone could just like say something, that would be excellent. But first, because it seems like we don't have too many TTRPG gamers in the room with us, I would love to just define some terms really quickly. So what the heck is TTRPG? TTRPG stands for Tabletop Role-Playing Game, which is a kind of embodied role-playing game where players take on the roles of characters in a shared fictional setting and describe their actions and follow a formalized system of rules to determine the outcomes of those actions, which may or may not involve some sort of RNG randomizer, like dice or cards or anything like that. There's a wide variety of TTRPGs. The most popular and well-known one is Dungeons & Dragons, currently in its 5th edition. People might also have heard of Pathfinder, Shadowrun, Vampire the Masquerade. There's a video game version of it, but it also began as a TTRPG, stuff like that. So many different genres of TTRPGs, many different styles of play, and the greater details I'll go into in more depth during my prepared talk later today. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's get started. So who am I? I am a trans and queer 1.5 generation Chinese American person. What that means for me is I was born in Boston, but I actually grew up in Shanghai from when I was about 2 years old to about 9.5. And when I was about 9.5, I came back to America from China. And this upbringing came with a lot of cultural collision, a lot of friction-informed identity creation for myself as a young person, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of love and joy. Especially as I began to grow into myself as a queer and trans diasporic Chinese storyteller. So in terms of my scholastic background, I went to Hampshire College for undergrad, which is a small private liberal arts college on the East Coast in Western Massachusetts. And I graduated with a self-designed major in screenwriting and critical race studies. And during this time, I also began my journey of playing and GMing TTRPGs. Most of you have probably not heard of this show before, but I got into TTRPGs actually by listening to The Adventure Zone, which is a podcast run by the McElroy brothers. And it's an actual play, which is basically you record yourself playing TTRPGs and then you release it to an audience, right? So a nerdy activity becomes even more nerdy because people are listening to people play. They're not even necessarily playing themselves. But this format of entertainment is actually massively popular within a growing, but still niche in a lot of ways, audience. So I got really into the Adventure Zone's Balance arc, was kind of the name of their first campaign. And it showed me what TTRPGs could be. Because for the longest time, my kind of assumption or stereotype about tabletop role-playing games or Dungeons and Dragons is that it's a kind of like pen and paper board game. It's like Monopoly, but with more steps. You know, like you roll dice and you have characters, you go, you dungeon delve, you get treasure, you track that, there's experience, but you have to write it down. I was like, well, I could just play a video game and I don't have to track all that stuff. I didn't realize that TTRPGs were such a rich space for role play, character creation, getting to not just tell a story with my friends, but learning more about myself. And again, I will be delving into this in more detail during the Q&A later today. Even though I didn't do APs until after I graduated undergrad, I did do my entire life. I've been very much like a theater kid, like very much like a writer, a performer. So I did improv all through college, actually all through high school and middle school as well. And my first ever like D&D campaign and table was with actually my friends from the improv troupe that I was a part of. So we really went all out. It was surprisingly a really dark and serious campaign, even though we were all improvisers. So that was a interesting turn of the dice. And like I mentioned, it wasn't until after I graduated, so after 2019 into 2020, that I started doing actual play. And at this point, the pandemic had just begun 4 years ago. At that point, I was furloughed from my day job. Everything was really unstable. Everything was really strange. And so I decided, you know what, with my free time, I'll start a Twitch channel, and I'm going to call it Transplanar RPG. And I thought it was so clever, because Transplanar RPG is an all transgender, people of color led dark fantasy actual play channel. We tell stories set in an original non-colonial anti-Orientalist multiverse. And our first main campaign, which is called The Second Stranger, was a D&D 5th edition show that launched in 2020. And the premise of the show was that it follows 8 broken heroes trying to mend a broken realm after a strange cataclysm rips the stars out of the night sky and vanishes the gods. And this is a campaign about finding hope in apocalypse, about accepting your flaws, accepting your brokenness, and discovering the capacity for love and goodness in everyone, even in the face of oblivion. And this show streamed weekly for 3 years, and at this point has over like 120 episodes and over a dozen spin-off, one-shot special sessions. And we started our production as well has evolved immensely, over the years, like our Twitch overlay, a podcast integration, our YouTube uploads, very much I cut my teeth on actual play storytelling, both the craft aspect of it, the producing aspect of it, the community management aspect of it, the publicity, the marketing, all of that, the financing, the development, cut my teeth, all of it on The Second Stranger. And it came to a glorious end 3 years later in mid-2023, so mid-year last year, and it was followed by Godkiller. Godkiller First Blood is a 16-episode podcast-only miniseries based off of an original duet, which means two-player, TTRPG of the same name, Godkiller, that I wrote and I designed myself. And I'll talk about the game design aspect of it later in this presentation. So the series of Godkiller First Blood follows a young heretic from a dirt-poor mining town as they confront the gods of their home. And the gods are modeled after the major arcana here. And then eventually they emerge in a baptism of blood and fire to become this figure known as the Godkiller. And the game and the series both grapple with questions of mortality, of divinity, of monstrosity, of trauma, of grief, and of course, of community, love, and acceptance. And as part of the Ashcan release, I produced a series of Godkiller First Blood one-shots featuring various incredible GMs, that's short for game masters, people who run games, and players in the actual play or AP space. And the Godkiller miniseries ran for 16 weeks, so a week per episode, and then it was time to release the second main campaign on Transplanar, which is the Chaos Protocol. It's currently ongoing. Chaos's premise is that it follows 3 doomed agents of a secret transplanar syndicate as they travel across the multiverse, answering distress calls and unraveling a dark mystery at the heart of reality. And this show explores themes of vengeance, revolution, and grief. So probably a narrative through line you've probably picked up on at this point is that all the shows that we do are pretty dark. They're pretty dramatic. They're pretty serious. And that's by design. We are all artists and storytellers interested in grappling with these heavy and complicated and deeply personal themes. And actually, as of this lunch, we are halfway through Arc 2 out of 8 planned arcs for the Chaos Protocol. And as like an added kind of thematic diegetic tie-in, we use a different TTRPG system for every arc to reflect the premise of hopping across planes. And yes, we do get new art in a different style for the characters every arc, which is very fun. And we recently had Erika Ishii on as a guest player for our latest episode. You can see them in the bottom right corner. If you're not familiar with them, they are a voice actor and a AP performer who's been on like D20, CR. I just love Erika, and I'm so happy we got to collaborate. If you like video games, they voice Valkyrie in not Valorant, in Apex. And they're also the voice of Anna Bray, the new voice actor for Anna Bray in Destiny 2. So that's the creative journey so far of Transplaner since 2020. Definitely started as a hobby, right? A passion project. But in the 4 years since launching it, it's grown to be my full-time job. Through Transplaner, I get the chance to explore themes of monstrosity, of grief, of revolution, of vengeance, of hope, of community, of love. And it's been really wonderful to see how it's been received by the wider games and entertainment industry as a whole. One of the earliest coverages we got actually was back when we launched in 2020 from Wizards of the Coast through Dragon Talk, which is their official D&D podcast. We've also been listed as a D&D or TTRPG show to watch in multiple publications, kind of best of compilations for APs, such as this one in the bottom left from the Mary Sue. And in 2022, I started cross-posting clips from our shows to TikTok and then to YouTube Shorts in late 2023, so last year. And many of those clips actually have since gone viral, which has helped our show grow and reach brand new audiences. I have a lot of thoughts about vertical short form, actually, as a content creator. And at the end of 2023, I was featured in the official D&D yearbook alongside my work on Transplaner and my work as a game designer. So as an AP performer, some highlights of my career include just getting to play with, GM for, and panel alongside so many incredible creators in this space, which is always such an honor and a joy. A highlight of 2022 was being invited into the Dome in LA to talk about my GMing and world building process with Brennan Lee Mulligan as part of Dimension 20's Adventuring Academy series. I actually learned this before the lunch. That's actually how I was discovered by Virginia Tech, which is so exciting. And a highlight of last year, 2023, was definitely being able to participate in my first ever live show as an AP performer at Big Bad Con in San Francisco, where almost all of my cast from Across the Second Stranger and the Chaos Protocol were able to fly in. We were able to like get everyone there, fund it all, and get everyone to play together. It was an absolute blast. Over the years, I am really proud to have worked with my cast and my crew to build an immensely passionate fan community. And this is just like a tiny snapshot of the incredible fan works that have come out of people who enjoy our show. And I really wish I could find and post every single piece of fan art or fanfic or fanimations, fan cosplay, even fan tattoos that people have gotten, because every time I see one, something in my heart very much blooms and grows. I'm very proud, very honored to have such an engaged audience of primarily other queer and trans people who see themselves represented in our work. And as we continue to grow, just last year, we actually got a feature about our show in Polygon, as well as Dicebreaker. And it's very encouraging for our work to resonate with and be visible within the greater TTRPG ecosystem as a whole. As for my journey as a game designer, it all started in 2021, so about a year after I started streaming Transplaner as an AP performer, when I released a couple of modules and a micro RPG as part of dipping my toe into that side of TTRPGs. And these smaller releases actually went really well. And Halo and Horns, the micro RPG that I mentioned, it's an RPG that fits on one page, so the rules are all just like on a single page of paper. It was even featured in an in-studio show on Hyper RPG, which was super exciting. And at that point, I started getting tapped for various projects in the space, highlights of which include the Republic City supplement for Avatar Legends, which is the official Avatar World IP RPG, the Tianxia World Guide for Pathfinder, published by Paizo, and all that said, though, the game design highlight for me so far, though, is definitely Godkiller, which I mentioned the AP series of earlier. I started working on this game in 2021, and I was accepted into Magpie Games' Ashcan development program for it in 2022. And if you don't know what an Ashcan is, it's a term that actually came from comics. In TTRPGs, it means basically like the playable alpha. It's like a playable beta. It's like a pre-release of the full game that contains the core rules, like everything you need to know to just run this game. There's no addition, there's no art, there's no layout. It's just kind of printed words on a page with very minimal layout. Just the core rules, usually only like 30-40 pages, whereas a full game can be over like 100 to several hundred pages long because they have expanded like options and setting material and stuff like that. So I worked on this Ashcan version, this pared down, just the core rules version of Godkiller, for over a year with Magpie. by a really rigorous developmental process. And then I decided at the end of that contract to self-publish it through my platform as a digital-only offering to kind of like cut down on costs. And that actually went really well. And at that point, Godkiller had caught the attention of various publishers in the space. And after some phone calls, some more Zoom meetings like this one, I was able to ink a deal with Evil Hat Productions to publish the full game, which will include like a print edition, a solo play variant. So if there's just one of you, if there's only one person, you can still play the game, right? A multiplayer variant, because the Ashcan only supports duet play or two-player play in the current state. So now you can play with multiple people a game of Godkiller. Just a lot of fun. So overall, I just really love facilitating, playing, and creating TTRPGs because this medium allows me to imagine, come up with, and embody characters and worlds beyond the ones that currently exist, right? Worlds that reflect better possibilities for me, for my loved ones, and for everyone around us. And this is a topic I'll be talking more about in depth during the Q&A later today. But for now, the main takeaway and the send-off for my slides is that I just really like TTRPGs. I just think they're neat. And that's me. That's my journey through the space. I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go. Bam. And yeah, I can just like open the floor now to any questions that folks might have, any inquiries you might have about any aspect of this journey, whether it's creative or career-based or production-based, developmental-based, culturally, anything like that.
Yes, there's one hand in the back.
I think I'm curious about your career path. When you get excited for the online, design and online, probably in our parents, especially Asian, Chinese parents, playing PC game is definitely no relevance to jobs. How do you stick out the path? I'm really curious, and transfer or convert the thing you love become the thing you can do and make life.
Yeah, totally. So, my mom definitely does not approve necessarily of this career path. I think it's always a hard sell, especially for Asian parents. I can speak to my experience as a Chinese person. The child of an immigrant, really, because my mom immigrated to the States when I was like 9.5, to find a better life, right? To have a better future for me. And obviously the original hope for my mom, for both of her children, I have an older sister, is that we'd become a doctor or a lawyer or a wonderful scientist, right? Or something, right? Something legitimate, something stable. Right, something stable, something with a 401k, right? Something legitimate with a health plan. And I think, much to her dismay, both of her children ended up being artists. And I think for Asians, for my family, the legitimacy is money, right? So if you're able to sustain yourself with this, it's kind of like, oh, this is weird, but if you're like making enough money to like pay your rent or like buy a house, I guess I can't really be mad at you, and that's always a really hard place to get to. So there's both the consideration that I'm able to make this my full-time job, but it is always kind of like a hustle. It is a grind. I am in a lot of ways, I'm self-employed, right? I run my own company. So there's always like the ups and downs of that. There's the feast and famine of that. A lot of this also intersects with my journey of queerness and transness, which adds another vector of like friction and difference between me and my mom, right? She was not always very accepting of my queerness. And in a lot of ways, she still isn't, right? She just doesn't get it, right? She's kind of like a conservative, like older Chinese woman. And I think there's a lot to be said about, there's this lovely book called The Queer Art of Failure. And it means kind of accepting the fact that when you're queer, a lot about you has already failed in the eyes of society, in the eyes of your family, in the eyes of your parents, right? Because you will never be the lovely straight cis daughter that she thought you would be, who would like marry a nice Christian Chinese boy, right? And like have the 2 kids, send them to private school. Like that's very much a dream that has died, right? In a lot of ways for my mom. So I think in some ways, hilariously, I think I prepped her for my my career choice as an artist by coming out to her when I was 14 of being queer, because like that was one disappointment that she was already able to kind of swallow. And then the second disappointment of like, oh, you want to be an artist full time? Like, oh, well, you're already queer, so I guess that's fine, right? Which is why like a theme in so much of my work is monstrosity, right? Is flaws, is brokenness, is being able to embrace the value inherent in each of us just by being people, right? Instead of what we produce, right? Instead of what we are able to generate under capitalism, right? And I think there is a deep revolutionary transgender joy in that, in being able to accept like, yeah, like I will never really fit the mold that people are expecting of me. And that's nothing to be ashamed of, right? In fact, I will hold the shame like a blade between my teeth, and I'll use it to cut you when I tell stories, right? I'll make you look that shame in the face and see that it only ever reflects your face instead of anything about me, right? So all of that is to say, my mom still doesn't really understand what I do. Native Mandarin speaker, right? English is her second language. And I started as a native Mandarin speaker. Like Chinese is my mother tongue, but you know, language skills are like a muscle. If you don't practice it, if you're not immersed in it, it atrophies. So, I was actually more fluent in Chinese when I was 7 than I am now, right? Like 20 something years later. So there is some degree of like a barrier too, like that has gotten wider between me and my mom and being able to explain what I do. Because I'm able to tell her in English, like, Mom, I stream tabletop role-playing games online on Twitch and YouTube and sometimes on TikTok. And she's like, okay. But she like has no idea what I'm talking about, you know what I mean? But she sees that I'm able to support myself, right? As for my sister, my mom has also accepted that she's an artist because my sister kind of went the institutional route, right? She works at DreamWorks, which is like a company my mom understands. She's like, oh, they make movies, or they make like animated movies, they make animated shows. And like, you know, she has like a job with them, a career, right? But there's the added layer of difficulty in TTRPGs where there are no real like stable careers in APs. There are some stable careers in game design, right? Like if you work at Wizards of the Coast or Paizo or Chaosium or these big publishers, right? Like as like a marketing person or as a designer, right? Or in development or in distribution or something. But overall, it's a really small niche space. And to be able to carve out what I've been able to carve out has been an uphill struggle this whole time, not just against like, you know, familial values and assumptions, but also against bigotry. Because when I say we're an all transgender people of color led channel, you know, it's not a far stretch. We've received a lot of hate comments, a lot of trolls in all of our social media platforms. And, you know, it's something you just have to deal with and develop thick skin about and be able to continue seeing the value that you bring to the table regardless of what other people think, even if that other person is your parents. Yeah, a really long-winded answer to your very succinct question. I hope that illuminated some things.
Yes, Luke.
Yeah, you talked about it a little bit when you were answering the last question, but I was just wondering how you sort of incorporate your multiple identities in like game design.
Yeah, of course. This is definitely something I dive into like with detailed prepared notes in the Q&A portion, but kind of my identity informs every aspect of what I do. Not just the art I create, but how I see and understand the world. And this isn't just true for me as someone whose identity is othered, right? Like you look at me, you know, and I say I'm trans, I say I'm queer, right? I have a partner, you know, who's also trans. Like the people I surround myself with are very diverse, also very trans, very queer. And you're able to see like, okay, Connie is marked in some way, like is marked by society. You look at me and you kind of know that, you know, I'm kind of strange, right? Like I'm different. But I would say that everyone brings their own perspective too. Like it's really just about whether or not you're aware of it, right? Everyone has a biased positionality. Right. And I use biased not necessarily as a negative term, right? Because my bias is one as a queer and trans diasporic Chinese American person. Like that's just how I see the world. That affects how I move through the world. That affects everything I do. So in terms of how these things emerge in my game design and in my storytelling, I'll talk about God Killer for a little bit. The main game that I'm currently working on. I have to finish the text this year, as part of my contract. And I have described this game as a holy punk duet game for one player, the God Killer, and one game master, God. And the game, basically in this game, if you're the player, you play as a figure known as the God Killer. You go around this world killing gods, right? Or you can decide to spare them. And it's the challenges you face have to do with questions of choice and power. So the core question isn't, are you able to kill a god? There's a move in the game that says you kill a god. You're, as long as you fulfill like a specific set of requirements, you can kill any god you come across, right? The question isn't about power scaling. It's not like, is Goku, or can you beat Goku? That's not the question here, right? The question here is, why? Why will you choose to kill this god, or will you spare this god, right? So it's going into the emotional world of how you will use the power that you're given, right? I very much strongly believe, and this perspective is informed by my identity, that power by itself is not a bad thing, right? It's not, power intrinsically has no intrinsic value. It just is, right? It doesn't corrupt, it reveals. So what people do with that power shows who they are. Right? So the same person with the power to kill a god can decide to go across the world and just kill everyone you come across, set up like a fascistic ethno-state, right? And declare yourself the god emperor. That's a pretty evil thing to do, I would say, right? But the same person with that same power, like a different person with that same power could choose to go around, the world trying to help liberate people from oppressive or downtrodden or poverty-struck situations, right? And that reveals something about yourself as well. So it's questions about the choices you'll make, right? Because that first choice, I would argue, is easier. It's easier to do. It's simpler. It requires less emotional self-reflection and less intellectually rigorous, I think, reflexivity. You can just kind of go around, you see something, everything's a nail when all you have is a hammer, right? You just bang, 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 you kill and you hit and you defeat everyone, right? But the game and the mechanics of the game are specifically designed to kind of add friction to that process and make you question why you're doing the things you do, right? And make it a emotionally enriching and fulfilling experience in that regard. So that is very much informed by my perspective as like a trans Chinese person, seeing people around me with power, what they choose to do with it. I'm like, well, if I had the power to kill a god, I'd do this. I've got a list, I would do this. And the game kind of allows you to kind of live that out and make the choices you will within, I think, the safer play space of imagination. And that's also a reason why all of these themes are so consistent and so frequent in my AP performances as well, right? Like, The Second Stranger is very much about kind of the last thing I say as a game master, and kind of like the send-off for the last episode of The Second Stranger is that we learn to love ourselves not because of our brokenness, not in spite of our brokenness, but alongside it, right? So we're not fetishizing our depression or our anxiety or the fact that we're oppressed, we're not saying that is what makes us special and cool and unique, right? But it is part of what defines us. But the beautiful thing is how we struggle and rise above, alongside the fact that we are, that we are oppressed and that we face bigotry and all of these challenges, right? So I hope that answered it in some way.
I think my question just comes out of what you were answering, actually. So are these gods that you have in your game inspired from the gods that you've known, or are these someone that you've created? And if it is someone that you've taken inspiration of, is it not scary to hurt religious sentiments when you're putting people in a position of choice?
Yeah, so the game itself very explicitly does not use any real world religions in the god making. Like, there's no Jesus or anything like that, or like there's no like Krishna or anything like that. There's not even like a Zeus or like Greek mythology, which I think are often seen as safer, right, religious topics to go after in media. And that's very much on purpose, because the point of the game is to kind of come up with your own cradle, which is the name of the setting, which is genre agnostic, right? One person's cradle can be like a cyberpunk dystopia where the gods are forgotten memory ghosts trapped in static, you know, and another person's cradle could be like a dark fantasy Game of Thrones kind of esque setting where the gods are like actual like big D&D gods that you can't ever really see or reach. They live in another plane of existence or something, right? So the game actively invites the game master and the player, the two people playing the game, to like come up with your own pantheon and draw on your own cultural touchstones instead of, if you want to, right? It's optional, or you can just come up with things that are kind of like culturally agnostic. And the full text will also include like guidelines around how to do that in a way that isn't appropriative, right? In a way that isn't reinforcing negative stereotypes about certain cultures, especially if they're cultures that you're not a part of, right? Or in ways that are like genuinely very offensive or heretical, like using holy, sacred, closed images that if you're not part of the practice, you shouldn't even really say the name of or like depict the likeness of, for instance, like considerations around that. And I'll be working with like a team of cultural consultants from different religious backgrounds than me to be able to like make sure that it reads across different kinds of religions. What's been really interesting, so I mentioned a series of one-shots that I did as part of like releasing the ash can with like a bunch of different tables. There was like a graphic up with like 6 different people, like 6 different pairs next to Godkiller. And they all built their own cradle. They all brought their own kind of inspiration to it. A lot of them were like real world agnostic, like they just made up, you know, they made up gods and they made up a world. But one of the tables drew on Greek mythology and featured some actual gods from Greek mythology, like Chiron, the boatman. I think like Hades, like actual Hades was there. And I also think that Persephone was actually there. And I've also seen, since then, since the Ashcan is publicly available, I've been tagged in various like shows when people are producing their own Godkiller APs that have nothing to do with me. And one of those producers is a Latin creator, and he's drawing on specifically like traditional like Mexican gods, and is like bringing that part in that folkloric culture for him that I know very little about, but I think it's super neat, right? And like he's very much imbuing the show with his own cultural touchstones. So I think something like that is really cool when it comes from a place of like lived experience, and it comes from a place of like, oh, I'm a person who you know was brought up in this religion, and I am this religion, and I would love to explore my relationship to this religion using this game. I think that can be a very fruitful and very cathartic experience to have, versus like if you're like a random white person and you're like, I think it'd be interesting if my gods were from this culture that I'm not a part of, right? And that's very much something I'm against. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
What would you say have been like some of your biggest creative influences in your work?
Oh, so many.
JRPG stuff, but that just might be my projecting.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Might be, I think I'm hearing a lot of JRPG stuff, but that might just be me projecting, I'm not sure.
No, I love a good Shin Megami Tensei game. Let me tell you that. Yeah. Some JRPGs, not too many actually. But I have described the plot of The Second Stranger before, and someone was like, "Isn't that just like Final Fantasy VII or something?" And I'm like, "I've never played that game before, and I don't know." But I would say some explicit inspirations for just my body of work as a whole would include, I really like The Raven Tower by Anne Leckie. It's a novel and it deals with gods. It has a really interesting magic system. It's a retelling of Hamlet, but in like a fantastical world where deities exist, and it's just a really interesting approach to magic that I've been deeply inspired by. Recently, I've really been enjoying the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir. It deals with questions of devotion in really like sanguine, bloody ways. Questions of death and love, right? Questions of worship by choice versus worship by force. I think, you know, that's really driven a lot of my inspiration for Godkiller. This is actually a prepared question from the Q&A portion that I'll dive into more detail about. But in terms of generally speaking, I'm deeply inspired by horror, because I think horror as a genre, I especially love monster flicks. I love a really well-made monster because I think it reflects what a society is scared of, repulsed by, but nevertheless entranced by, and sometimes even like sexually entranced by in so many ways. Some of my favorite horror films include Alien. I really like The Thing. I'm really into Suspiria, both versions. And I really enjoy it. And I think a big fascination of mine also, in addition to questions of monstrosity, are questions of the taboo, right? And the different ways we approach the taboo. I think there are ways we can approach taboo topics that are very normative, right? That like, oh, those things are disgusting and shameful, let's like not look at them. And then there are ways that we can kind of like invert them, right? And like kind of think about taboo as a language of the dispossessed, right? As a language not necessarily of resistance inherently, but at least of like forcing hegemony to look at something that it's been trying to hide or exploit or shove down, but in our own voices, right? I think as queer people, a lot of the time we are already labeled as inherently monstrous or deviant or threatening or unsafe in a lot of ways. I mean, just think about like the kind of insane transphobic backlash that's happening right now, this like insane manufactured culture war against trans people. Like people didn't give a fuck about trans people like 10 years ago, but now it's like a hot topic to talk about, right? And trans people, I think specifically being labeled as monstrous in current day discourse. So there's a lot of empowerment and also like liberation that can come from claiming that monstrosity and saying, you know, like, what does it even mean to be a monster, right? Like, is that even a bad thing, right? According to whom, right? The logics of that. So horror films, big fan. I'm also deeply inspired by poetry. I really love Ocean Vuong. I love how they play with lyric and theme. Justin Philip Reed is an incredible Black queer poet whose work is kind of insane and really good, deeply inspiring. Human Tran is a queer Viet poet who writes a lot about, you know, belonging, diaspora, queerness, homophobia as well, whose work I really enjoy. And yeah, my partner is a dance scholar, and through them I've actually absorbed a lot of like interest in critical dance theory. I think a South Indian choreographer and dancer, I think her name is like Ananya Chatterjee. She makes incredible work. I recently saw a performance of hers, like raising cultural questions that makes me think in a kinetically embodied way that is really relevant to me as a performer, you know, like I have to move my body and embody characters and situations. So I think there's a lot to be learned from dance as well and dance scholarship.
Other questions? Because I have a few. But I want to make sure.
You have another?
I want to make
I'll
sure.
follow you.
Oh, okay. Okay, fellow Smith graduate here, which is why I know Hampshire very well. I was just wondering how, or do you think that geography also influences identity? Because this is one I've been working on, is space, race, and identity. I've taught a class on that, and so I was just curious as to what ways in which geography can inform identity, but also because you're creating new worlds and new ways of being. How do you understand place if you're creating new places or realms of and spaces? So I was just curious because in our center too, we also have a map, and all of the students can put where they're geographically located. So I was just curious as to how world making works. If like, and how is it informed or not informed by geography and place?
Absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts about that actually. I think geography is really important. I'm not a geographer or a climatologist or anything like that. I know that there are some world builders who go deep in, they get like deep in the sauce about it. They're like, okay, so in my world, there's this like mountain spine. And because of that, you know, obviously in the shadow of the mountain spine, there's gotta be like a rain shadow there, right? So these kinds of cultures would grow here, and they build their world according to like real life geography, right? They're like, oh, well, it's kind of like there's a delta here. So there's like a fertile crescent here. So of course there would be like a big civilization here. Oh, and the people who live in the plains here would probably be more nomadic in nature. And the people, you know, like, so there are some people who think that geography is destiny, right? I think that's a really white supremacist way of thinking, actually. That isn't even necessarily rooted in reality. I think when we think about geography and fictional world building, we have to think of borders. And we have to think about what a border implies and what a border creates, right? There are natural borders, right? Rivers create natural borders in the real world, like oceans, bodies of water, mountains, valleys, plains, and whatnot. But there are also like just as real socio-political borders, which, you know, a border implies the violence of its enforcement, right? As we see reflected in reality. And as someone invested in non-colonial anti-Orientalist world building, that's not necessarily something I'm interested in playing through, because I live it in real life. My friends live it in real life, you know? That's not necessarily a trauma we want to kind of just play through in a disempowered or uninterrogated way in our games. So when I create different nations, different countries, I, first of all, think of the cultural and historical and social factors that distinguish them, right? So I do think it can be really fun and really interesting to have like a group of, for example, nomadic hunters, right? Versus like a settled city built into a mountain stronghold, right? An added layer of that is and this is actually it's a hot topic in TTRPGs right now, and it has been for like at least 5 to 10 years at this point, is the question of fantasy race. So like elves, orcs, dwarves, devil people, angels, right? So like there's a lot of fantasy world building where it's not just kingdom borders, but also like racial borders. So the dwarves live in the mountain stronghold. The sea elves live underwater in this like underwater version, which is totally not Atlantis that I'm ripping off, right? Like the gnomes live in an artificer made sky castle that elevates itself with clockwork gears. I'm just like pulling the stuff out of my ass, right? Because it's super easy and I think it's kind of intellectually lazy to world build solely around race, because when we think about how race functions in real life, we often end up kind of like reifying and reinforcing harmful, negative, bigoted stereotypes and philosophies around like real life different races. Because in the real world, race is not a scientific reality. There's like no gene that makes you black, or a gene that makes you Chinese, right? Or like a gene that makes you white. It's completely socially determined, right? There are various genes that like come into play that kind of affect your appearance. And a lot of that is situated on, I think, your relationship to the place that you live in geographically, like whether you are a citizen or not, or if you're undocumented, right? Are you undocumented here? Like what kind of a passport do you have, right? Like you could be like, ostensibly, there could be a kid who looks white who is a Chinese citizen, right? Ostensibly, right? This is theoretically possible, who like speaks fluent Chinese, right? Because they were raised there. So even in the real world, the boundaries of race, nationality, ethnicity, religion, creed are a lot more porous, I think, than normative society wants it to be. Because when you can categorize people, then you can separate them, you can oppress them, you can control them, right? You can and ultimately you can exploit them for labor, right? That's where so much of this points toward. So I don't want that mess, right? In my fantasy world, like I'm already in real life, like in a lot of ways advocating against that. I don't want to spend my creative energy advocating against it like explicitly in my games as well. Like it's a game. I want to have fun. I want to be able to imagine. I want to play. I want to tell an interesting, cool story that isn't predicated on the dehumanization of my players or their characters. So when we loop that back to geography, then yeah, I will have different kingdoms, I will have different factions and groups, because I think it's interesting when those groups have different goals and they collide, right? That's where conflict comes from, where like different people want different things, bam, there's conflict, right? And that's what makes something, that's what gives a narrative momentum, is the conflict. That's what makes a story interesting, right? At least the stories to me. So instead of like these nations just hate each other because they're different nations, right? Like, for example, the kingdom of Tulong just hates the kingdom of Wuhanahi because they're different, right? I give them, if they were to be at odds with each other, I make it deeply personal, right? I'm like, okay, who in these nations have agendas and like, what are they playing at, right? And like, if there is some kind of like, rah nationalistic fervor, then it's dealt with in a deeply introspective way. Like, it's never presented at face value to the players. It's always like, okay, this seems like propaganda, you know, like, and what's behind the propaganda? Like, let's have you dive a little bit deeper, right? So yes, my answer to that question is like, yeah, I do create different nations and different countries, but I don't focus on like the violence of enforcing those borders in like a real world way. I focus on like more deeply personal stories.
Thank you. We have time for probably one more question. Anyone else before? And in the chat? No. On Zoom? Anyone? No, it was just me, nothing else. Anyone else have a question? Besides Jen, you already asked, I just want to make sure that everyone else asks a question before I ask it.
I don't know what's been asked already, but I consider myself a storyteller and I want to know how I can improve and whether or not I should study that in school.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask what kind of storytelling you're interested in, or just generally speaking? Like in terms of the medium you like to work in?
I play TTRPGs, I write prose as well as short fiction stories.
Oh, nice. That's excellent. I would say craft is the most important and the funnest part for me of storytelling. All the other stuff, the marketing, the publicity, the development process, like learning how to pitch yourself, that's also vitally important, but it's like not, it's not the fun part. It's not what draws us to storytelling. So I would say, you know, first and foremost, there is no barrier to entry when it comes to storytelling. Everyone is a storyteller. I think humans, you know, even when you're hanging out with your friends and you're like, oh, last weekend, like I went to this bar, you're telling a story, right? You know, and there's a craft to, you know, a beer and pretzels story too, right? Because I'm sure you've hung out with someone, maybe you even have a friend whose stories are super long-winded and you're like, oh my God, just get to the point, right? Or you have someone who's like really good at telling stories and you're like, maybe you should do stand-up, right? So like there's all of us, even from when we were children growing up, just talking to people, socializing, we learn storytelling. Everyone intuitively, in some way, informed by your personal experience and positionality, understands what it means to tell stories, right? Like, so ostensibly anyone, even if you don't have any screenwriting experience at all, could sit down and write a script because you're like, oh, I've seen movies, right? If you've seen a movie, ostensibly you know how to write a movie. There's a beginning, middle, and end. Bam, that's it. And there are so many different schools of thought about craft, about what makes for a good story, what makes for a bad story, what makes for an interesting story, what makes for a boring story, right? And I would say to learn to tell stories better, immerse yourself in as many different kinds of stories as possible, both in terms of medium. So like read a lot of books, right? If you want to make movies, watch movies and also read books. If you want to be a writer, read books, but also watch movies, right? Watch dance, listen to music. Don't just do it passively, though, as an act of consumption, which I think is what happens to a lot of us, especially when we're beaten down by capitalism. Sometimes, you know, after a long, hard day of work or school, you just want to go home, you just want to fucking like mindlessly play a video game. You just want to sit down and you're like, I don't want to think about anything. I just want to grind. And I'm like, well, probably playing competitive games is not the best way to unwind, and that's at myself because I do that. So there's a difference that's needed too, right? Art and games entertainment can be a lovely release valve of pressure, like okay, and now I can like relax and go back to studying or go back to working. But that's really different from watching art as an act of like of critical thinking. So like I would invite you to read a book and really take note of what you like about it and what you don't like about it. That's like the first step to improving yourself. Like take your favorite book and highlight sentences you think could be written better. right? Like from a craft, like a grammar level, like a sentence level, and then expand the scale, like bit by bit. Okay, now this paragraph. What do I like about this paragraph? How it's structured, how it begins, how it ends, and then think about it on a chapter level. Like what's working about this chapter for me, right? What's not working about it, and then think about it on like a whole work level about the book itself. Like, okay, like how is this book reading for me? Like, what's it trying to accomplish, and does it do that? And I think if you're able to answer those questions about any piece of work that you come across, then you are very well equipped, I think, to improving your own craft. And it just, this is a really boring piece of advice, and it's oft repeated, but it's true. It works. You just have to do it, right? To get better at something, you just have to do it. There's that saying of like 10,000 hours, right? Makes someone a master at something. So if you sink at least 10,000 hours into running or playing tabletops, into writing, right, into pottery, what have you, whatever it might be, you're gonna just get better at it. I think there's even a study. I actually don't know if this is just like an urban legend or like if this is like actually real, but regardless, take it with a grain of salt, but also maybe take something of value from it if you want. Of there being a pottery class at a college, right? And the professor split the class into two halves. One half, they said, okay, your grade is going to be determined by the quality of like the final assignment. And so that half of the class spent the entire semester like working on one piece of art, like perfecting it, just making it as good as possible. And the other half of the class, the professor said, okay, your grade is going to be determined by how many pounds of clay you work with. So the other half, they were just making stuff. They were just churning out pieces like really crappy little teacups and like vases and doing as many using as many pounds of clay as possible. And by the end of the semester, kind of both from a qualitative standpoint and from like an enjoyment standpoint, the second group was much better, leaps and bounds like in front of the first group. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Your first piece of art, don't put the pressure on yourself for it to be perfect, right? If you want to design games, write it. That's why I wrote a bunch of modules and a micro RPG before I kind of dove into Godkiller. And even Godkiller took me like 3 years to get to this point, right? It's about iteration, and just doing it. And just as important is having like a consistent practice that you can stick with. And the most important thing about a practice is whether or not you can do it. So don't like the next day wake up and be like, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and write for 2 hours. And then I'm going to drink coffee and I'm going to hit the gym, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's great. You can maybe keep that up for like a week, right? But the reason why people burn out on New Year's resolutions is because they set the bar a little too high too quickly. You want to like slowly work your way up to something you're able to manage. The best routine is one you can stick with. So even if you have to start small, start small.
Wow, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I know I'm very long-winded, so I appreciate all of your attention as I spoke.
Just to let you know, Connie will be here again in New.
Yes, so yeah, if you want to take an hour break and if you have more questions for Connie that they haven't answered yet, please come to Newman Library. If you come through the cafe, it's on the first floor in the Goodall room. Just come through the cafe and you'll see the poster. And Connie will be with us from 2 to 3, giving again, sort of part prepared presentation and then a big chunk for Q&A.
Thank you. And
And there'll be food there too, if you want a second lunch. We got
and also we have a lot of events for APIDAHM, so please join us if possible. We have quite a few more events even this week, including mixed race APIDA's panel and who will be featured. Some of the students here are going to be featured at the panel as well. And then we also have the artists in residence coming. They have an exhibit on the second floor in Perspective Gallery, and we'll be giving a learning lunch as well as an artist reception and talk later that day too. But thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Connie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch.
Thank you.